Hello, welcome to this week's video. Now, in this week's video, I'm going to be reviewing Alex Van Halen's new book, Brothers. And just to kind of cement my credentials as a Van Halen fan, I'm going to show you a track that I wrote on one of my two Van Halen guitars. Here's the other one. I'll show a track at the end where I played this one as well. So there's my two Van Halen guitars, so I'm a massive fan, so I was really looking forward to this book coming out. So the track first, then on to the review. Before we start the review, I'm just going to say there's not going to be any spoilers particularly in this video, because none of the stories he tells aren't stories that are available to read in lots of other books, but these are from his perspective. So I'm going to give my opinion and my kind of reaction to his side of the story. So if you don't want to hear that, don't watch the rest of this until after you've read it. But as I say, no plot spoilers particularly. Eddie Van Halen was one of my biggest guitar heroes growing up. Like, I didn't ever really try and play like him. I learnt a few of his songs and solos and stuff, but I think part of it was I probably thought it was too hard. I was never a great practicer. My idea of practicing would be sitting down with a book of Beatles songs and strumming through them. But kind of I've got more and more technical, I suppose, as I've got older and just carried on playing rather than sitting and practicing. But when I was 14, trying to learn those Van Halen solos looked very complicated at the time, and still is. But it was such a massive influence. I wore Converse shoes for a long time by a friend of mine, me and Matt, who was the first person I rung after he died. We'd wear clothes that we saw him wearing on the videos and stuff, and there's a photo of me somewhere, let me see if I can find it and post it up here, of us when we went in the record shop and got the For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge sign out of the record shop after they'd finished with it. And I have to confess that when I used to see people grieving over famous people that they'd never met, I used to think they were a bit peculiar. I couldn't work out quite what it was until Eddie Van Halen died, and then I genuinely grieved over it. I was very, very upset about the whole thing, and it was a very weird feeling. I was Googling, should I feel this upset about somebody I've never ever met? And after he died, I started reading all the sort of material I could get to, listening to the music again. I hadn't listened to it for a long time. I'd kind of, my musical tastes had gone off in different directions. I hadn't listened to Van Halen. It was a very weird thing that after probably 25, 30 years of not really listening to it particularly, I could remember all the words. And this is going to be an unpopular opinion, but I quite like the albums with Sammy Hagar on, partly because I absolutely love Sammy Hagar's voice. They're not necessarily the best guitar playing, but I do like his voice. And as I say, after he died, I started devouring all the stuff that I could find that was written about him as well. And there was a book of all the interviews that he'd done over the years. These were mainly audio books that I listened to. I listened to the Noel Monk's account of the whole story. I listened to the Ted Templeman book, which talks a lot about when he discovered him and producing their records. And I listened to the Sammy Hagar book, but more on that later. The only one I hadn't listened to, that all of these books were quoted quite heavily from in Alex's book. The only one that I haven't actually read is the David Lee Roth one, and that's because it's not available on audio book, and that's the only way I get a chance to listen to these things these days. I don't have time to sit and read as much as I'd like. So I was very excited about this book coming out, and I've literally just finished listening to it this morning, and it's there's elements of it that are very touching, very emotional. There's some very interesting things and interesting omissions in it as well, I have to say. And it's narrated by Alex himself, which I think makes a massive difference. I always prefer listening to those kind of books when they're narrated by the person who wrote them, especially when it's such a sort of personal account. And right from the start, it's so clear that this is going to be the closest you're ever going to get to a kind of personal memoir from Eddie. I mean, there's been lots written about him and lots of interviews, but that would be about the music, and you'd kind of they're kind of embellished, and they're not necessarily talking about their feelings about their story, etc. But this is really, it starts off, and some of my favourite bits of the book right at the beginning, and he's talking about these struggles that they went through together, coming to America, not being able to speak a word of English, they're mixed race, they get segregated when they start school and get picked on, and they have to go through all this together, which creates this incredible bond. And he speaks about this, and he speaks about it at the beginning and the end of the book, about how much he misses him and how close they were, and you really get the impression of how close that relationship was and what a massive hole it's left in his life. So the middle of the book kind of covers the story that you all know, or if you're a big fan of Van Halen, you'll know about the sort of rise from Van Halen from being this sort of party band based in Pasadena, getting signed, and their sort of ascent to mega stardom, because it's the first time that it's been recounted sort of first hand from one of the Van Halens, and it's a really interesting perspective. And I particularly like he talks about some of the recording processes, and he talks about particular songs and what he likes about it. And what I liked about it, while I was listening to it, I then flick onto the track that he was talking to remind myself of it. And he sort of talks about his feelings about the tracks and the sounds and stuff, and it gave me a chance to sort of listen with a completely fresh set of ears and a different perspective. And it's made me realise what a fantastic drummer he was for a start. I mean, and the way that the two of them played together, that kind of swing, the shuffles they get, which a lot of other rock bands didn't quite master in the same way. And I'm sure a lot of that came from them being actually proper musicians and players that, from a very young age played in their dad's band, doing all kinds of function gigs and cover gigs, and you can hear that they've just learnt their trade. And when you really listen to the sort of subtleties in the playing, when you can hear it, particularly on Van Halen 2, the drum sound on that, you can really hear what's going on, and the sort of subtleties on the guitar. It's great to listen to with that new perspective, and this book enabled me to kind of hear it in that way. What's also clear in here is how much kind of respect that Alex has for David Lee Roth. It's a kind of it's almost a bit of a sort of love-hate relationship, that they fought a lot, and he sort of acknowledges his faults, but he admits that he fought a lot with Eddie, which everyone knows. They used to have massive bust-ups, like I guess any family would. But Alex seems to acknowledge that the band wouldn't have got anywhere without Dave. How he and Eddie, Alex and Eddie, shied away from the publicity. They didn't like giving interviews, and they didn't like the attention necessary. They just wanted to be musicians. But Dave, on the other hand, all he wanted to do was be famous. It didn't really matter whether he was singing. He was never particularly into the music. And he acknowledges the fact that those two things working together, they were a team, and the fact that David Lee Roth was such a showman and an egotist, and he mentions all the sort of bad things about that side of his personality, but also it seems to me that he acknowledges how important that was to the band making it. And he also compliments him on his lyrics, which they are great, and he quotes quite a lot of the lyrics right at the beginning of each chapter. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to read a lot of those lyrics, because they are good. I mean, there's a complete nonsense and complete madness in them, but there's also some absolutely brilliant bits. One of the things he does mention in there is about Noel Monks, who, as I mentioned, I've read his book and his account of this whole story, and he says he doesn't know, he kind of gives the impression he doesn't know why they ever got him as a manager. He recounts some story about how he made a massive organisational cock-up right at the beginning of their career. And interestingly, I think it's in, I can't remember which book it is, but Alex Van Halen, after Noel was either sacked or left, I can't remember which, he got in his brother-in-law, which he does mention was a great manager and took them on to further success after David Lee Roth left. He also talks about Ted Templeman's book, which I listened to a while back, so I can't remember exactly the details, but he says he disagrees with lots of stuff that Ted wrote in there. There's some bits he does agree with, but it's so interesting hearing these stories from two different perspectives. I don't think you'll ever get to the bottom of what is actually true, but it's great to get another take on it. It's also interesting hearing the story from Alex's perspective about Eddie building his own studio and how they were no longer kind of at the mercy of the record company having to pay and being on a limited sort of budget and on time constraints of recording, and how the fact that they had all the time in the world allowed them to create 1984, which, you know, has been kind of, he thinks, and is almost universally accepted, is probably the best Van Halen album. Not necessarily my opinion, but that seems to be the and it probably is, isn't it? And it's got some of the greatest songs on it. It's got their only #1 single on Jump as well. And he goes on quite a lot about how Ted Templeman never liked the song and didn't want it to be on the album, which is interesting. One part of the story I did find very surprising is how Alex is still angry with Eddie for having done the solo on Beat It. I'd have thought that would have blown over for a long time, but the way he speaks about it, he still has never forgiven him for having done it. He said they were a band, they shouldn't have ever done things separately, and they spoke about it before he was going to do it, and Eddie agreed that he wasn't going to do it, and then he went off and did it while Alex was away for the weekend. And Alex still maintains that it wasn't helping Van Halen increase their popularity. All it was doing was helping Michael Jackson increase their popularity. Apparently Eddie didn't really even know who Michael Jackson was, sort of living with his head slightly in the clouds at the time. And he still sounds like to this day says that he shouldn't have done it. I mean, which does seem a bit strange to me, because I can't, you know, you always say there's no such thing as bad publicity. I can't imagine that it really did Van Halen any harm at all having Eddie playing on that record, even though he was on the record that kept 1984 off the #1 slot. But anyway, that was just an interesting thing. I had heard that they were angry with Eddie for having, the rest of the band were angry with Eddie for having done the solo at the time, but I'd imagine that in the fullness of time, with the sort of success and fame that brought him and the band, that would have blown over, but clearly not. So in conclusion, I have to say I found the book very moving, and I couldn't stop listening to it. It's absolutely brilliant, and I would urge anyone to listen to it. I'd say listen to the audio book, having done it myself, because it's great to hear Alex recounting the stories and he laughing at some of the sort of stories in it. He reads it really well. I did enjoy his telling of the story. What is weird is a lot of the stuff that he's quoting Eddie as having said, he's lifted from interviews rather than them talking themselves. I mean, I guess he wasn't writing down their conversations, and there's got to be massive chunks of that time that he can't remember, because, you know, by his own admission, he was a raving alcoholic, so his memories are a little sketchy of some of the time. So a lot of the stuff he's quoting to sort of help the story along comes from these interviews, which are, you know, I've read before and are freely available. Also, what's weird is there's very, very little mention of Michael Anthony. He's mentioned in passing half a dozen times, but doesn't really ever talk about him at all as being part of the band. He talks about Dave a lot and how he's a driving force, but he really doesn't mention Michael. He mentions him getting married, he mentions how he didn't have a very good bass sound to start with, and it seems weird that he was such a big part of it for such a long time, and really the book is all about that classic Van Halen lineup that Mike barely gets a mention. But one of the weirdest things, and I was hoping it would carry on, is the book basically finishes when David Lee Roth leaves. It doesn't go on to... Sammy Hagar doesn't get any mention at all, apart from having been the singer in Montrose, who they supported early on, and how Ted Templeman wanted to replace David Lee Roth with Sammy Hagar before the band even recorded their first record. But beyond that, he doesn't get any mention whatsoever, and the story ends in about 1984, really, when David Lee Roth left. Now, what I'm hoping is that might mean there might be a second book which covers that era. But it's interesting. I would have liked to have heard his perspective on that whole part of the story, but it's not there. So fingers crossed there might be a second part to this book. But whatever, I would say definitely read it. If you're a Van Halen fan, this is the closest you're going to get to a memoir from Eddie himself. He's the person that was closest to him. And those little sort of stories about how when they were younger, that's the only place you're going to get these first-hand kind of accounts of the story. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope that was a useful review, and you're either going to go out and read it, or you already have and maybe agree or disagree with me. Leave a comment, let me know what you think if you've read it as well, or you're going to plan to read it. Hit subscribe, hit like, leave me a comment, always enjoy that. And I'm going to leave you with another track that I wrote. I actually got this guitar before I got the stripy one, and this was a track that I did when I first got it. I apologise for the video being slightly blurry. I didn't notice until I replayed it. I was going to stick it on the end of this video that it was blurry, but anyway, hope you enjoyed the track. I bring out new videos at 7 PM UK time every Friday, so I hope to see you next week.